going to have time to do. I'm hoping to spend more time on the questions than we usually have been, and we'll spend a fair bit of time in the text of the lesson as well as looking at some of the scriptures upon which it's based and some, particularly another psalm that I think is pertinent. And then we'll get into lesson 18, stirring up your local church, in addition to encouraging your friends and family. Got an announcement to make real quick. For those who haven't heard, and I meant to double check this with Tim before we got here tonight, and I completely slipped my mind, but we were intending to have a meeting with Rick Knight to talk about some building security type things this Saturday at 10 a.m. He had a family emergency that precludes him being here at 10, but he can do 3. And Tim sent out an email, and as far as I know, we're planning to meet at 3. So there's a chance that'll change, but as far as I know, we're planning to move to 3 p.m. for that. Hi, Philip. I know you were here. Okay, with that, Dustin is going to lead us in an opening prayer, and then we will get into the lesson.
Heavenly Father, we come to you now and thank you for another opportunity to meet with fellow Christians and to study your word. We pray, dear God, that we can pause ourselves from the world just now and open our hearts and our minds to the lessons that are taught. We pray, dear God, that we take those things and become better servants for you as we live our lives in this world, that we can be examples to those around us and spread your word, dear God, and bring other souls to you as well. We pray you give those who are not with us tonight. We know we have some traveling, others battling illness. We just pray that you help them overcome their obstacles and bring them back to us with one sake. Heavenly Father, we thank you for Christ and the sacrifice on the cross. That sacrifice that allows us the opportunity to have it. We just praise you and thank you for that. It is in Christ's name that we pray all these things.
Okay, so on page 83, the title of the lesson is Encouraging Your Friends and Family, and we've gone through a whole bunch of different concepts for how to build our zeal and how to properly contain it, how to direct it, and now he's really getting into how to make use of it, what sort of things we ought to be doing with it. And as we think about spreading our zeal, the first sentence of that first paragraph says, the first people you will share your zeal with are your friends and family. That I don't think that's going to be a huge surprise to any of us, but that's very true. And we shouldn't neglect that. We shouldn't forget it, especially as we think about our families. Having 4 little kids of my own and coming from a family of 6, and my dad is one of 6 kids. I've got a very, very large family, and most of my family are Christians. And so I can see a lot of the topics in this lesson borne out in my own family and family history. And I can see a lot of the pitfalls, and I can see a lot of the successes. And I certainly want to do everything that I can to encourage and to duplicate those successes. On page 84, can I get a volunteer to read the first paragraph just down to before the bullet points? Denise?
Every zealous Christian, single or married, parent or not, needs to build his household as an ark. This means constructing it by God's blueprints, filling it with God's precious cargo, and depending on God's promises. Noah demonstrated amazing zeal in building the ark, and God used it in saving his household.
Thank you. Okay, so he started with this metaphor. He's talking about Noah and the way that Noah built this ark. Why did he choose that metaphor? If your household is compared to Noah's household, and your house supposedly is your ark, then what is outside of that? You see?
Well, I think if he hadn't followed the plan, the ark would have sunk. It would not have been saved.
Okay, yeah.
I mean, so that stands out.
So the obedience to God's instructions is what brought about the whole family's salvation, not just the head of the household, but the whole family. Matt?
Well, you've got the world. The world was all around him, which was what was being destroyed. And the ark was kind of his way of locking down his family and keeping them safe. And it's kind of the same way with us. Like with our households, we have to keep the world out as much as we have to be in the world, but we've got to keep it out and protect protect our families.
Absolutely. There's a barrier that ought to be in place. As you alluded to, Matt, and this, I know you're talking about 1 Corinthians 5. 1 Corinthians 5, where Paul says, I told you not to associate with anyone who is sexually immoral. Well, I didn't mean people of the world, because then you have to leave the world. And that's not really what we're supposed to be doing as Christians. He was talking about within the church, but in the world, we expect to have to be around evil influences. But we should have a barrier to protect those under our care. Not constantly. There's a time that comes when Noah and his family got off the ark, and his family had to go and face the world again, in a manner of speaking. And our kids are going to have to go and face the world as they grow up as well. But we need to be the ones who establish those parameters and who build those boundaries and who determine the time when they have to really face the world. So it starts, and this is where Missy was getting at with God's blueprints. Obviously, it wasn't quite a blueprint, but God gave very specific, detailed instructions to Noah about how to build that ark. And as she said, if Noah had disobeyed those and said, well, I see what he's going for, but I think it would look better this way, that would have demonstrated pretty clearly that he didn't really have that much trust in God and wasn't really all that interested in obeying him. And why would God have saved him and his family then? And so the author of this book here, he refers to Matthew chapter 7, verse 24. I'll go ahead and take that one since I'm in the neighborhood. Matthew 7:24. Everyone then who hears these words of mine and does them will be like a wise man who built his house on the rock. So he's comparing building by God's blueprints, or building according to God's instructions, to building on the right foundation. Right? God has selected a site, he has laid a foundation, and he said, this is where I want you to build. And if we try to pick a different foundation and build it in our own way, then it's not going to be a very sound house, will it? Along with that, and this is just something that I couldn't get out of my head as I was going through this lesson, turn to Psalm 127. Yeah, eventually I'm going to get there. Psalm 127, it starts out, unless the Lord builds the house, those who build it labor in vain. Considering the context, the area of the Psalter where this appears, the superscript that what's the word I'm looking for? Attributes this psalm to Solomon, and some of the context that follows in this psalm, he's talking particularly, not exclusively, but particularly about the temple that Solomon had spent so much of the early part of his reign completing. And unless the Lord builds the house, those who build it labor in vain. He'd been a part of that huge project. He'd been the director of that huge project, and is acknowledging that if we do it wrong, if we do it in a way that is contrary to God's instruction, then it's all a waste of time. And that's the same point that Jesus is trying to get across about building your house on the rock. Okay, well, it moves on. The next bullet point is God's precious cargo. Are you zealously Are you zealously caring for one another and bringing the fruit of the Spirit into your actions? So we've got to build it on the right foundation. We've got to build it by the right parameters, according to the right instructions. And we have to keep track of what's inside it. Don't build the house and then forget about the things that it's supposed to protect. That would be a really bad idea. And that brings us to Psalm 127, the second half of verse 1. Unless the Lord watches over the city, the watchman stays awake in vain. How can this be a problem for us as we try to build our households?
Pretty much who you associate with is kind of what your character is. It shows. What I'm trying to say. You want to put people around you that are going to build you up and help you to reach your goals. You're not going to put somebody that's not, doesn't have some of the same things that you do, the same views that you do. And you want somebody that that's going to be there for you, kind of like watch your back.
You wouldn't want to bring a threat
Correct. Yes.
to where the innocents are, right? You want people that are going to help and not hurt. So as we're trying to care for, as he puts it, God's precious cargo, as we're trying to care for the souls that God has entrusted to us, we've got to keep that in mind and do our best to actually protect them. And if we're not doing that according to God's standards, if we're doing that in, let's say, physical ways, if we're doing that in maybe academic ways or financial ways, well, that might be okay. But if we're not doing that in spiritual ways, then what's the point? Unless the Lord watches over the city, the watchman stays awake in vain. We've got to do it according to the right standards. Keep our spiritual house in order, or none of the other things matter at all. And then finally, he mentions God's promises. That's the third bullet point there. Are you zealous enough to put your complete trust and faith in God? Do you take on extraordinary challenges to shine as a light in the world? And how does that correlate to the story of Noah? Misty?
They'd never seen rain, so he had to have a lot of trust to build what God said to build, the way he said to build it to begin with. Rain was a foreign concept to them, so to get that much rain was even bigger. So you don't trust in God's promises. What are you doing?
Okay, so he demonstrates a great amount of trust. What else? There's one other element that I think is really important to this. Now,
He followed it completely because it says complete trust. Because you can have partial trust, and he could have tried to have his own backup plans. Okay, I'm gonna kind of do what God says, but I don't see how this is gonna work, so I'm gonna go ahead and do it this other way too, just in case, kind of thing. And I think that's a complete trust in I'm gonna do what God says, even if it doesn't make sense to me, because I trust God completely.
And that's I don't know that I should say that's the hardest thing for us to do. That's the hardest thing for me to do, is when I don't quite understand, is to still obey God. I know that I should, but it's not always easy to do. Mark, did you have something?
Well, let's not lose sight of the fact that Noah did this over 100 years. So could you imagine being the only person, your family, everybody else thinks there's no telling the things that he could probably make fun of him, probably, just being that way for 100 years, constructing the ark about things that Mallory just mentioned, things that you just have no idea of what's in store, but yet God told him to do it, and he trusted God. He did that. He followed that God's instructions for 100 years.
That's right. So even though every indicator outside of what God himself had told him was this is a bad idea, he continued to work on it. He continued to, as the author here says, shine as a light in the world. Now, nobody except his own family were saved, but the fact that he still shone his light matters in God's eyes. Mallory?
I think for me, I get that they had never seen rain before, but they've seen water. I'm sure they had boats. But to have all the animals confined in one thing, I think for me that would have been probably a bigger thing. Okay, I'm going to build this thing, and then you want me to fill it with animals. I think that's that's another aspect of it that you can sometimes do really. That's never been done before. You don't corral animals into a confinement. I don't care how big the ark is. And they're going to have to go and stay with all these animals to trust God that okay, that there will be enough food and enough water and enough everything to take care of all of us in this confinement. Right. So the rain part, but then what happens after that? It's not like it's going to rain one day and go on our houses and then come back out. It was a long period of time with a bunch of them.
Yeah, so what he's doing, it really does seem absolutely crazy. And yet he stuck with it. We need to have that same kind of zeal and devotion. And that brought me to think about Psalm 27, verse 2. It is in vain that you rise up early and go late to rest, eating the bread of anxious toil, for he gives to his beloved sleep. if we're putting our labors in the wrong areas, instead of doing what God says, instead of putting our trust in Him, then, well, what's it going to profit? It's not going to bring about what we really wanted it to do, no matter how hard we work at it. If we'll actually put our complete trust in Him, then He will see that we are taken care of in the long run. Okay, that brings us to the next section, forge new friendships that challenge you. Can I get, let's see, 2 volunteers, one for the first paragraph under there and another for the second? Matt?
For your zeal to last, you must forge friendships with fellow Christians. Regular participation in worship services, lectureships, youth camps, and other events for Christians will help your entire family meet peers whose faith is on fire.
Okay, now these are some good ideas, aren't they? It's not, there's not anything in 3 Peter that says thou shalt attend lectureships, but it's a really good idea. If we're looking to meet peers whose faith is on fire, that's how you would go about doing it. There's some good suggestions in here. If you're not already implementing those, then I would suggest that you try. And who would like to read the second paragraph?
Look for friends whose zeal for God challenges you to live even more courageously and selflessly. By choosing friends who share a common passion for the Lord, you will enhance each other's spiritual fires.
Thank you. Okay, and the reference there is to David and Jonathan, by the way. Their friendship demonstrates this kind of relationship. Those two both had put their focus on pleasing the Lord, and it shows in the way that they treated each other. So that got me just thinking about my life and when it's been easier for me to do what's pleasing to God and when it's been harder. And that leads me to ask, and just think about this, who are your best friends? I know for me, the list of people that came to mind under best friends was a pretty worldly group of people. Even some of whom were actually members of the church, but they behaved in worldly ways a lot. It's been a lot easier and a lot more beneficial for me to pick friends who were zealous for the Lord. And when that list was replaced with a bunch of steadfast Christians, things really changed for me. If you haven't already done that for yourself, again, I would suggest you do. He goes on to talk toward the bottom of this page about Jesus' earthly family. Who would like to read the second to last paragraph on page 84 for us?
In the earthly family of Jesus, his siblings initially thought he was crazy. Despite their criticism, he stood firm. Eventually, the zeal that burned within his heart spread to the rest of his family. Even when it's unpopular with those closest to you, be steadfast in your zeal for the Lord.
Thank you. Okay. This is something that we don't talk about enough, I think. Can somebody turn to Mark chapter 3 and read verses 20 and 21 for us? Who'd like to do that?
20 and 21?
Yep.
And he came home, and the multitude gathered again, to such an extent that they could not even eat a meal. And when his own people heard of this, they went out to take custody of him, for they were saying, he has lost his senses.
Yeah. So, from the early days of Jesus' ministry, his own family, not only have they decided he's off his rocker, they're trying to actively force him to stop what he's doing and take him away because they don't want that to continue. Not only are they not behind him, they are actively impeding his work at this stage. Okay, can I get somebody else to read John chapter 7, verses 3 through 5? Matt?
Therefore his brothers said to him, leave here and go into Judea, so that your disciples also may see your works which you are doing. For no one does anything in secret when he himself seeks to be known publicly. If you do these things, show yourself to the world. For not even his brothers were believing in him.
Thank you. Okay, so up until that last sentence, it kind of sounds like his brothers are encouraging him now. They're saying, well, Why don't you go down there? That's where all the people are. That's where all the religious leaders are. If you want to make a name for yourself, if you want to reach people, that's what you should do. But then it says, not even his own brothers believe in him. What are they actually doing when they tell him this? Misty?
So it's a little sarcasm, kind of making fun of him a little bit.
Okay, I think that there is some sarcasm, but I think they have something a little bit more momentous in mind that they're really going for. Mallory?
If you were to go down to these religious leaders and do this, they knew it wasn't going to be received well. And so they're kind of trying to take the guilt or blame off of them and have other people tell him to be quiet, so that way they're not the bad guys.
They're trying to get him to go to Judea and humiliate himself, after which presumably he'll turn around and come back home with his tail between his legs, and he won't go pretending to be Messiah anymore. That's pretty horrible. These are Jesus' own brothers. They're still impeding him. They still don't believe in him at all, and they are trying to make him go and humiliate himself. Dan?
I'm asking because I'm not sure. I've read this before and chewed on that. Both of his parents, they were told of his origin in miraculous ways. So I mean, are we to assume here that even the brothers just were never told that, or at least didn't accept it? I'm not aware of anything where that indicates that they do, or at least should have known.
It's tough to say. I don't want to judge them too harshly, because like I say, we don't know all of the details here. We do have, earlier in John's Gospel, of course, in chapter 2, he's there. I don't remember if it mentions, I think it mentions his family, but it certainly mentions his mother being there at the wedding at Cana. I'm going to double check that real quick. Third day. It just says the mother of Jesus. Why did I think? Sorry?
It says his disciples were with them.
His disciples, yeah. I remember that. I was thinking that it mentioned his brothers too, but I could be wrong. So even in that case, maybe if it's a family wedding, a family affair, then they would have been there, but we don't really know if they're not mentioned. As you said, Dan, certainly Joseph and Mary had been told plenty. As far as we can tell, Luke mentions a couple of times that Mary laid up all these things in her heart, but even at the time when he's 12 years old and he gets sort of left behind in the temple, or left behind in Jerusalem, and they find him at the temple, they don't seem to really be quite aware of what he means when he says, "Didn't you know that I would be about my Father's business?" So yeah, we shouldn't. It's really easy for us to play Monday morning quarterback on everything that everybody ever did that's recorded in the Bible, and say, well, I wouldn't have done that. But realistically, we probably would have been just like Jesus' brothers were in not believing him. The majority didn't believe him, even when they saw the works that he was doing. Okay, be that as it may, though, they're actively impeding him. He actually sort of publicly shuns them a couple of times, and they don't trust, they don't believe that he is who he says he is at all, and yet we've got one book of the New Testament called James, which by all appearances is written by James, Jesus' brother. We've got another book of the New Testament called Jude, which by all appearances is written by Judah, Jesus' brother. So those two ended up being very influential and very faithful members of the church. In fact, if there's question about either of those, there are a couple of passages mentioned here in Galatians 1:19 mentions James, Jesus' brother. That's the one I was thinking of that had the disciples and the brothers and Mary all in one place. In Acts chapter 1, verse 14. Acts 1:14, all these were with one accord devoting themselves to prayer together with the women and Mary the mother of Jesus and his brothers. So even by the day of Pentecost, at least two of his brothers were there with the disciples. And as time goes on, Paul mentions in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, he's writing to these Christians in Corinth, and he says in verse 5, Do we not have the right to take along a believing wife, as do the other apostles and the brothers of the Lord and Cephas? Apparently, even the Christians at Corinth were somewhat aware of Jesus' brothers enough to know that they had wives, and for Paul to appeal to that. So clearly they were pretty influential. Clearly their zeal was spreading around and having an effect on other people. That's a really good lesson for us to learn. It's really easy for us to be discouraged and downtrodden when our own families don't support us in what we're doing or actively hinder us or think that we're nuts. Sometimes, with time and continued effort, you might find that they turn out to be great assets to the Lord's church as time goes on. I hope that will happen. Okay. Oh, boy, I knew we were going to have to rush through a lot of this. He talks a lot about raising children here. I encourage you to go through that, read the passages that he mentions if you haven't already. And for the sake of time, let's get into the questions on page 86. Number 1, select a Bible family that could serve as a role model of zeal in your home. Who did you select and why? Mark?
Go with Abraham.
Abraham? Okay, why?
Well, I mean, obviously Abraham's a great man, but he had an absolute trust in God that I think probably, if I had to pick one individual that had really, really faith and trust in God, I'd have to go with Abraham because of what he was asked to do.
Yeah, I imagine you're thinking especially of the sacrifice of Isaac, right? That he was willing to go through that, and that it reads as if Isaac wasn't putting up a fight. And if Isaac is at least somewhat trusting and willing to go along with this. I don't want to read too much into that, but we don't see Isaac even making some of the mistakes that Abraham made. That's a good example. Now, Abraham and Sarah have their problems as well, of course, but they work through them and they continue to please God. Others? Dustin?
Joshua,
Joshua Cameron? Why?
I think he was a really good example. Not only was he a follower, he did what he was told. He was a leader too. As for me and my family, we will serve the Lord. Mm-hmm. Not as for me, I will serve the Lord. As for me and my family. So he was not also a servant, he was a leader.
He says that with great confidence and should be taken seriously. And all of us heads of households ought to be able to say that same thing. Not just as for me, but as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. I had a tough time with this one. I went through and I thought about Abraham. I thought about Joshua as well. There are only a couple really, of examples of families in the Bible where you see dad, mom, and kids who all do well consistently at pleasing God. And there's some lessons right there for us to learn, of course. And usually when that happens, it's pretty light on details. I'm sure we're just missing all of the ways in which they failed to please God. But one that popped to my head when I thought about it was Amram, Jochebed, and their children, Moses, Aaron, and Miriam. Now, Moses, Aaron, and Miriam all did bad things and are remembered for those bad things as well as the good things that they did. But boy, if there was ever a family that had a zeal for the Lord, that would be it. They were willing to go against the law that Pharaoh had put into place to hide Moses for 3 months. And then, these children end up being the ones who lead the nation out of Israel and help them through the infancy of this covenant between the people and the Lord. So they're a great example. Another good example is Joseph, Mary, and Jesus. And we just talked about the other kids and some of their shortcomings, but in the end, it seems to have worked out quite well. And Joseph and Mary are both excellent examples of how to be a devoted husband and father, how to be a devoted wife and mother, and to please the Lord in all of it. And I'm sure Jesus was the model child as well. We're just not told that much about his childhood. Oh boy. Number 2, how can you best model Christ-like zeal in your home? What zealous actions do your children witness in you that encourage them to live with life values? Philip.
Not my home, but something that always affected me growing up was no matter what, we went to church. There was a basketball game or a football game, we went to church. And just the fact my dad would come in from the fields each day, Wednesday night or something like that, he'd shave, get ready to go to church. And I think that makes a big impact.
I agree. That's the way my family was too. And it seems like it's a relatively minor thing, and I would say it is kind of a relatively minor thing. But to have that decision implicitly already made, to where there's no question, that makes a world of difference for all of us as kids growing up. It makes a difference in our kids' lives. What else? Yeah.
Hesitate to bring it up, but trying to involve the kids in opportunities like that has been something we've been trying to focus on as they get older and they can start understanding. So, like as an example, every fall I go over to Dave Dickerson's house on Sunday since he's not here. But I go over there and I help him trim the trees in his yard at the end of the season. And for the last couple of years, I've been bringing them to I'll probably bring a Viva this year. They see, we talk about why we're doing it, and actually bring them in and they get to participate in it, not just hear about it or not just come here, Sundays and Wednesdays and talk about ideas. No, it's not this big grandiose thing, but they get to put some ownership on it. They, since then, Lucinda talks about it with Dave, but with other people as well.
And little things like that make a big impact. Those are times when it's easy for us as parents. We've almost always got a full schedule. We've got this and that and the other thing on our to-do list, and we don't have enough time to get it all done. And when something like that pops up and we know the options are take one or more of the kids with me and let them help or do it myself, it's going to get done faster and better if I just do it, right? But if I make that sacrifice and that investment in the kids, then the end point is going to be a whole lot better for them. And we would all do well to implement that with our kids. We could continue really just answering this question, I think, the rest of the night. But I threw down a few things. Prayer. Constant prayer. That's one of the areas where I fall short, and I need to get better and better and better at that. We have done a good job of developing a habit and rotating through, Anytime we have a meal together, we thank God before we eat. And it started out with, me saying that prayer every time, and then as each boy gets old enough to have some comprehension of what he's doing, we bring them into the rotation. I think that's going to be good for them. I know it was good for me when I was a kid. Being models of integrity and justice and mercy and devotion to God, to family, making sacrifices, being a model to imitate, constantly teaching, not trusting somebody else to do the teaching. If we'll try to do all that Christ does for us, for our family, then we will serve them well, and they will see that, and it will leave a lasting impact on them. Oh, man. Number 6, how are you defining success? And how are you defining success in the hearts of your children? Mallory?
So I have some, secular friends or whatever, and we do plays, and they're all homeschool moms, and our kids are not old, under 6. And they're all talking about how they're gifted in this, math or English, blah blah. And I just made the comment yeah, my kids aren't, gifted in anything. And she goes, well, they have compassion and they include other people and do this stuff. And to me, that was bigger. I was okay, so then what I am doing at home of making sure we take turns and that we're you teenagers at, 6 and 3 or 5 and 3, they're not, they're not perfect. I know this. But for even like the other moms who are very critical to other kids, that's one thing that's what they said that my kids are growing at. I'm like, you know what? They can pick up the math later, they can pick up the English later, but are they living, are the seeds planted right now? I don't know if it's gonna last. I hope so. But I think for me that's kind of where, because when you're home and you're doing the same stuff over and over again, I don't see it until someone else says, hey, you do these things. I'm like, okay. So that's how I'm defining it right now.
I think that's pretty much the right way to do it. You don't have to know algebra to get into heaven. Algebra's a great thing to know. I love it. I like farther than that, get some calculus in there. That's fun, but you don't need that to get to heaven. There are things that are a lot more important than math or science or language or any of that. No matter how much we get out of those physically, the spiritual is it's unthinkably more important. It doesn't even compare. All right. I wanted to talk about a couple more of those, but we just don't have time. Let's get into lesson 18, stirring up your local church. Now, I think a lot of this is somewhat self-explanatory, but let's go ahead and start in Acts chapter 18. I'm on page 89 of the book, about midway down the page. I'm going to go ahead and read that paragraph. In every local church, there are members just waiting to be better equipped for living with zeal. Look at how much good came from Priscilla and Aquila, spelled with the lesser-known 2L spelling. Interesting. Okay, sorry. Aquila investing in the zeal of Apollos in Acts 18. Although the Bible describes him as fervent in spirit, there was much he still needed to learn. By increasing his wisdom, his zeal was taken to a whole new level. If someone's in Acts chapter 18 already, could you read verses 24 through 28? Get that story of Apollos and Aquila and Priscilla. Dan?
A Jew named Apollos, a native of Alexandria, came to Ephesus. He was knowledgeable and competent in the scriptures. He had been instructed in the way of the Lord, being fervent in spirit. He spoke and taught accurately things concerning Jesus, though he only knew the baptism of John. He began to speak boldly in the synagogue. When Priscilla and Aquila heard him, they took him aside and explained the way of God more accurately.
Through verse 28, please.
When he wished to cross to Achaia, the brothers encouraged him and wrote to the disciples to help him. When he arrived, he greatly helped those who came to grace, who through grace had believed, for he powerfully refuted the Jews in public, showing by the scriptures that Christ was Jesus.
Okay, so obviously this was it wasn't an enormous investment that Aquila and Priscilla had to make here. It took a little bit of their time and a little bit of their effort. I'm sure it's a little bit uncomfortable, but they went ahead and did it. And this is not the last that we hear of Apollos. He's mentioned a couple more times. Paul talks about him he talks about him in 1 Corinthians, and he mentions him again later on. I can't remember where. Such a small thing, and yet it had enormous ramifications, not just right there, but even in different parts of the empire, different parts of the world, because they were willing to do that, because they were willing to teach him a little bit better and aim his zeal in the right direction. Okay, so what can we learn from Aquila and Priscilla in this?
They took the time and were willing to stand up and go teach somebody when it became apparent that they didn't know as much as what they should have or needed to know. And I think sometimes we hear things or see things that maybe we disagree with, and we stop with that instead of taking the time to sit down and talk with the person. Because it may be a case of, well, it's one thing you disagree with because, I don't like the color pink. But it's another thing if it's a scriptural matter and they take the time to sit down and study with it.
Yeah, and if someone is actively misleading others, it's one thing if they're actively misleading others and they know better, then there's one way to deal with that. And we talked about that in some sermons and discussions not too long ago. But when it's just for ignorance, lack of knowledge, then usually it's going to be received well. Dan?
Wisdom talks about not seeing it and quitting on it or having an opinion or whatever else. I mean, and then the flip side is that they also didn't crush him. Right?
Yeah.
He had all this motivation, and they helped him refine it. They didn't publicly dress him down right then, anything of that sort. We see that pretty quickly he is refined and he is working shortly thereafter.
That's a really good point. I haven't really thought about that before, but they had every opportunity and pretty strong likelihood of putting out the fire in him. And instead they went and tended the fire a little bit and made it a better one. Okay, what can we learn from Apollos in this interaction?
He was willing to learn and to study. I mean, it wasn't just, like Dan was saying, it wasn't that they were trying to put him down or, crush his spirit. He was actively trying to learn. And those who are actively trying to learn are willing to listen and to study and ask questions.
And so he didn't allow it to crush him. He didn't allow that to put out the fire. He just said, oh, well, now I know, and then went on about his work properly. Now,
He also didn't let his pride get in the way of saying, I've been doing all this stuff. No one's ever said anything before. How dare you come, So there's the two aspects. He could have been crushed by it, or he could have gotten super defensive by it. I guess there's two sides. The third one is what he did. But, usually our reactions are one of the first two. Like, am I going to get crushed by it, or am I going to get super defensive and double down and not?
yeah, and it's funny that our response, if that's the one that we take, is usually, as you said, because of pride. And we don't like feeling humiliated. We don't like it when our egos are wounded. But don't we all think a whole lot more of Apollos because he handled it the way he did and just accepted it? If he had gotten his back up and been all defensive about it, then we would have thought less of him. Then his pride really would have been damaged. But instead, he just took it and learned and moved on and continued to do his work even better. That is impressive, and we would do well to imitate him. Okay, as we're wrapping up here, turn to Hebrews chapter 10. It was probably fairly obvious that we would end up here before too long. Of course, we're not going to have time to go through every detail of the rest of this lesson here, but it's really built around this passage in Hebrews 10, verses 24 and 25. I'll go ahead and read those. And let us consider how to stir up one another to love and good works, not neglecting to meet together, as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day drawing near. Let me go ahead and read this paragraph at the bottom of page 89 as well. Hebrews 10, 24 and 25 doesn't just call saints to assemble for worship, but to stir each other up to love and good deeds. When a wife wants to stir up her husband's desire to take out the trash, she can comment on the bad smell, point to an overflowing can, or just say, please take out the trash. No matter what approach she takes, and by the way, on behalf of all the husbands, we prefer it if you would just say, please take out the trash. No matter what approach she takes, it all comes back to communication that raises his awareness of the need. A zealous church will stir up its membership by communicating about opportunities for engaging in good deeds to meet pressing needs. It's not that complicated, is it? And yet we sit and ponder and try to figure out, well, how do I stir up my brother and my sister to love and good works? I don't know how. It's pretty simple, really. As you said, you just got to communicate it one way or another. And there are different ways of doing that, and you can show, you can imply, you can just tell them directly. But one way or another, that's what we need to be doing and stirring each other up on a regular basis. All right, let me see what else I can get out of here in the last minute or so. See what's the most pertinent. I think it's worth spending a minute as we wrap up on page 91, the third paragraph from the end, right in the middle of the avoid weak preaching and teaching section. It says, don't skip difficult or socially unpopular subjects. He is dead right. Covering these topics well builds up existing members and reveals to visitors that you are a people of deep conviction who love the truth. To grow, churches need to cover meaty subjects. Planning and preparing Bible classes that systematically take students deeper may be challenging, but it will be worth it. And he refers to a passage that we've been using in Hebrews chapter 5, where the author insults his audience and says, you ought to be teachers by now, but you're not. You need milk instead of meat. It's really tempting to water things down. It's really tempting to try not to step on people's toes and try not to offend anybody. But that also doesn't do anything. That doesn't inculcate the deep principles. It doesn't get the values that God wants us to embody into anybody's hearts. And talking about the stuff that's difficult is what really challenges us and makes us think and makes us grow and learn. So let's all, as we try to stir each other up and as we try to, what did he say? Yeah, stir up our local church. That's something to keep in mind. Any last comments or questions? All right, next week we will try to cover chapters 19 and 20. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I appreciate it.
Had that bone broth tonight.
Yeah, it's good though.
Yeah.
I mean, I was thinking I need to get one of those roasted chickens, and I put it in a pot, or I put it in my crock pot, and I let it boil it until I can just pull the meat off.
Falls right off.
It falls right off.
Yeah.
Plus you get the marrow. That's what the bone broth is.
Yeah.
And they say chicken soup does that. You don't even have to put meat. You can just put chicken. Yeah. Bye.
Yeah. I looked it up and I was like,
I know. Keep not saying much coffee. But Mary's was better.
You got your mouth. You never take it. You want to take a little care? I'll take good care of them. I'll take good care of them. I'm free. I just gave it to you. The church is dying. Promise.
Good evening. Good to see everybody out here at midweek. Fletcher will be delivering the invitation in just a moment. Before he does that, go ahead and pull your songbooks out. Please go ahead and mark page 134. We will be singing that after Fletcher's invitation in just a short moment. 134. After you have marked that, go ahead and flip the page over to 136. We will sing Faith of Our Fathers to lead up to that. 136. Faith of our fathers, living still, in spite of doors and power and soul. Oh, how our hearts beat with joy whenever we hear that glorious word. Faith of our fathers, we will be true.
Our fathers sharing we're still in hope and conscience free. How sweet would be their children's faith if they like girl could die for me. Faith of our fathers, holy faith, we will be true to each other. Both friend and foe, in our strife, when preaching to by kindly words and precious love, faith of our we will be true to each other.
I have a little brother named Elliot. I call him my little brother, even though he's only a year and some change younger than me. Elliot is a police officer in Illinois. If he has something happen while he's on patrol that is outside of a typical traffic stop, Elliot will give me a call and tell me about it. One of the stories that he told me recently was that he responded to a report around midnight of a vehicle that crashed into a telephone pole out in the country. When he arrived, the 3 people inside the crashed vehicle jumped out of the car and ran into a cornfield nearby. Elliot jumped out of his squad car and chased him. He was able to capture one of the occupants by foot. Elliot returned to his squad car and caught the other 2 perps after he hid behind a nearby building and waited for them to return to the scene of the crash. He ended up arresting all 3 of the occupants of the crashed vehicle. After Elliot had told me this story, I thought about how we might try to hide and run away from God when we sin, like those 3 people tried to run away and hide from my brother. There are instances in the Bible where people attempt to hide or run away from God. In Genesis, Adam and Eve hid from God after eating the fruit from the tree God had commanded them not to eat. Genesis 3:8 says, Then the man and his wife heard the sound of the Lord God as he was walking in the garden. In the cool of the day, they hid from the Lord God among the trees of the garden. In Revelation, we read about, during John's vision, people hiding from Jesus during his second coming. Revelation chapter 6, 15, verse 17 says, Then the kings of the earth, the princes, the generals, the rich, the mighty, and everyone else, both slave and free, hid in caves and among the rocks of the mountains. They called to the mountains and the rocks, Fall on us and hide us from the face of him who sits on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of their wrath has come. Who can withstand it? Why might we try to run away or hide from God when we commit sin? It could be guilt, shame, a feeling of hopelessness, or any number of reasons. But we know that hiding and running away from God is pointless based on the examples of Adam and Eve and the people that tried to hide behind the rocks during John's vision. We also know that it's pointless because God is everywhere, as proven in Scripture. Proverbs 15, verse 3. The eyes of the Lord are everywhere, keeping watch on the wicked and the good. Psalm chapter 139, verses 7 and 8 says, Where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? If I go to the heavens, you are there. If I make my bed in the depths, you are there. Finally, Jeremiah chapter 23, verse 24 says, Who can hide in secret places so that I cannot see them, declares the Lord.
Do not I fill heaven and earth, declares the Lord? Rather than hide or run away from God when we sin, we need to run to Him and seek forgiveness. 1 John chapter 1, verse 9 says, if we confess our sins, He is faithful and just and will forgive us our sins and purify us from all unrighteousness. If you are struggling with a sin or sins tonight, repent and ask for forgiveness tonight. Do not say, I'll do it tomorrow when I wake up. Because Jesus could come back tonight. Matthew 24:44 says, so you also must be ready, because the Son of Man will come at an hour when you do not expect Him. If there's anything that you need help with, we are here for you.
Christian soldiers rise, and press the battle where the night shall dim the golden sun. Against the foe in guilty blood, let all our strength be heard. Faith is the victory we know, that overcomes the world. Faith is the victory. Victory, oh glorious victory that overcomes the world. His banner over us is love, our sword, the word of God. We tread the road the saints have loved, with shouts of triumph proud. By faith they light the world with breath, swept on o'er every field. The faith by which they conquer death is still our shining shield. Faith is the victory. Faith is the victory. Oh, glorious victory that overcomes the world. To Him who overcomes the foe, by greatness shall we give. Before the angels we shall know His name confessed in prayer. Then onward from the hills of light, our hearts with love aflame, we'll vanquish all the hosts of night. In Jesus' conquering name. Faith is the victory. Faith is the victory. Oh, glorious victory that overcomes the world.
Good again. See everybody out tonight. Thanks to Fletcher for his invitation tonight. And it was a good one, something for us to be considering. Sometimes that hiding is very overt and obvious in the way it's described in Genesis. Sometimes maybe I can say for myself. Sometimes in the past it's been a little more subtle. There's things that I'm ducking without disappearing entirely, as Adam and Eve were trying to do. So something for us to dwell upon tonight. Thanks as always to the Bible teachers who put in all the time preparing for classes tonight. Let's be mindful of the transition that's coming up, end of the month. Those new teachers to start coordinating those in the classes they're picking up. Even as we are changing curriculums, we still want to understand where these students are at and where we want to pick up all the different other activities they're doing in some of those classrooms. Jeremy had mentioned at the start of the adult class tonight the situation with Rick Knight. I'll recap that just very quickly. That Tim had sent an email out. Rick had a family emergency, so he is still going to be able to meet with us this Saturday for that presentation that he's going to be giving about building security for churches. So we are still having that meeting, but it's at 3 p.m. Instead of 10. So 3 p.m. Saturday. If you are interested, it's an optional thing. We will have some people from a few other area congregations who are coming out as well. So we do appreciate Rick setting this up for us. Other things that we need to make mention of tonight.
Kim was home with Bellamy tonight. Her stomach's been kind of bothering her. And then also we'll be traveling this weekend.
We've got several families who have been out and are still away from us. So a lot of people to continue to check in with, continue to pray for as we go through the rest of the week. Anything else we need to bring up specifically yet this evening? Okay. If there is nothing else, Mark Kaysen, you were listed for the closing prayer tonight. If you wouldn't mind.
Father, we humble ourselves before you, thanking you again for this day of life you've given us and for the opportunity we've had to come and quiet this place, Father, to set aside the cares of this life. Father, we pray that as we part this place, we consider the things that we expect, and that we will always, Father, be looking at our lives in relation to your will. We pray, Father, that we find that there are areas that we are not measuring up. We might realize and take advantage of the time and goodness and make correction in those places while we still can. Father, we ask your blessings on those, for a number who are going through with illness, who travel. We pray that you will bless us all in the coming days, and we might be able to maintain a measure of health, and we might be able to continue to look out our daily affairs and earning our livings. We pray for mercy upon our souls. Yes, this is Jesus' name.
You want me to try it? We can all